Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Susan Webb-Rawls, Director of Membership here at the Museum of Science and Industry, and I'd like to welcome you to today's lecture. This is part of our Inventive Genius lecture series for members, and today we also have other guests from the museum. Today's lecturer is Seth Mnookin, who is a critically acclaimed author of the book The Panic Virus, A True Story of Medicine, Science, and Fear. The Wall Street Journal suggested that this should be required reading for every medical student in the world. So it's got quite a following among people in the medical community. We thought this would be a great time to have him here and speak because we have our Body Worlds exhibition, The Cycle of Life, which talks about medical conditions throughout a person's life. After we contacted Seth, we found that there were 3 other organizations in the city who were eagerly looking to engage him as well. So today's lecture is actually jointly co-sponsored by the Chicago Council on Science and Technology and Northwestern University. Benjamin Brooks from the Chicago Council is going to just make a few remarks as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Benjamin Brooks. I'm the Programs Manager for the Chicago Council on Science and Technology, as Susan said. And I was going to sort of give a brief introduction for Seth, but I don't want to rehash anything that Susan has said and prolong this any longer. So without any further ado, Seth Mnookin is here to give his presentation on the panic virus. If you have any questions with regards to Chicago Council on Science and Technology, please feel free to see one of the staff members after the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you guys all for coming out on a rainy Saturday, or gray Saturday, which I guess is highly unusual for Chicago in the springtime. I am going to talk briefly about my book and how it came about, and then open it up to questions and talk about whatever it is all of you are interested in. I am more than willing to answer any question or try to tackle any topic as long as you all are okay with my saying that I don't know the answer, which I will probably do with some frequency. This book is not something that I was planning on writing. It was not a topic that I had been researching previously, and it came about because a little over almost 3 years ago now, my wife and I were newly married, or relatively newly married, and were doing newly married things like going to dinner parties and having adult conversations and all of those things. And we were not parents, but a lot of our friends were either expectant parents or parents of young children. And this topic, the issue of vaccines and vaccine safety, and whether or not there was a causal connection between vaccines and developmental disorders, usually specifically autism, was a topic that It was a topic that kept coming up. Felt like it was an odd. Was a topic that I oftentimes feel like I'm a young child when I'm talking in public, and that only accented it when the podium was up at my neck. It was a topic that kept coming up in conversation, and what struck me is when I would ask my friends how it was they went about making decisions about what obviously is a fairly fundamental issue regarding their children's health and parenting generally. The language in which they answered was oftentimes language of emotion or instinct or intuition. It was along the lines of, well, it feels to me like children are receiving too many vaccines too early in life. Or it seems to me that a developing immune system can't handle all of these vaccines. Or I just feel like I should trust my doctor, and so I sort of just do what he or she says, and that's that. And what struck me about those conversations was that was a vocabulary and a mode of thinking that these same group of people, the same group of people, was fairly dismissive about if it was applied to other issues involving the intersection of science and public life. For instance, climate change. If someone said, well, there was 6 feet of snow last year, I just don't feel as if there could be global warming, or evolution versus creationism. I just don't feel as if it's possible that I'm descended from apes. These friends of mine, these peers of mine, were very dismissive of that attitude, and the reaction often was, well, how can you rely on your instinct as opposed to what the evidence indicates regarding evolution, regarding climate change, regarding whatever. And so what I found curious about this was both that there was a seeming contradiction in my friends as to how they were going about thinking about issues, and that wasn't something that struck them at all. That made a lot of sense. There didn't seem to be a feeling that they should be going about this in any other way. And so when I started working on this, the sort of idea was that it would be a project looking at how we decide what counts as truth, how we go about making decisions regarding when we're going to put our faith in experts, when we are going to rely on our peers, when we are going to make decisions based on what we feel the proper approach is to something. And so I started researching this and proposed it as a magazine article using the issue of vaccines and autism as a way to look at that larger issue, and no one was interested at all. To the point where some editors were so uninterested that they didn't even write back to tell me they were uninterested. But it was something that I really I wanted to keep on looking at. I had studied the history and philosophy of science when I was in college, and so these were issues that I had actually spent a fair amount of time on, but hadn't worked on in my professional life. So I wrote up a book proposal, and one of the sort of oddities of the publishing industry, it's not hugely uncommon that a writer finds himself or herself unable to interest a magazine in letting him write 5,000 words on a topic, but can then interest a book publisher in writing 110,000 words on a topic, which may be why both industries seem to be rapidly going out of business. But and so I started working on this as a book in late 2008. As I said at the time, since I had not previously spent a lot of time looking at this, and it was not an issue I was dealing with on a personal level in my own life, I really had no sense as to where the evidence lay. I knew that within the medical community and the public health community, there was a fairly strong feeling that the concerns about vaccines and autism were overblown or not founded, and that there was a very strong feeling among a lot of parents that this was something that was being ignored. And as someone who had spent his career as a journalist and an investigative journalist, the notion that big business does not have people's best interests at heart and the government is incompetent that resonated a lot with me. And so, if anything, I was probably slightly more inclined to, not inclined to that view, but that view was one that I certainly could see being the one borne out by the evidence. And I also felt that certainly in terms of a storyline, that was more appealing. I think it's no coincidence that Erin Brockovich was a successful movie, and the story about the huge faceless corporation that isn't harming children has not been a huge mega bestseller so far, and I doubt will be anytime soon. Or the movie about mid-level government functionaries that are actually doing their jobs. That will probably not be Aaron Sorkin's next project. Although 10 years ago, if you had said his next project would be a bunch of computer nerds writing a program, you might have not thought that was very realistic either, so who knows. And I think the fact that I came into this without knowing a lot about the subject actually ended up being a very lucky accident for me. Anyone who has any connection with this issue, I think knows how difficult and painful it is for everyone involved. And because of the underlying stakes, when there is a difference of opinion, it really revolves around two groups, each believing that what the other group is doing and advocating is actively harming children, and possibly killing children. So if you believe that vaccines are injurious in this way, then the medical community and public health infrastructure and people advocating vaccines are actively perpetrating a series of injuries against children and sweeping that under the rug for the sake of profit, and if you believe that there's not evidence to support that and that vaccines protect against potentially life-threatening diseases, then people who are advocating against vaccine use are putting infants and children at risk. So even though there are other objectives that these groups are both working towards, better services for children with developmental disabilities, more research into effective early intervention, a whole range of things, there is very, very little discussion and cooperation. And the reason why I think it was lucky for me that I didn't know anything about this in advance is because it gave me an opportunity to spend an enormous amount of time with both of these groups. And I didn't realize until later how unusual that was. And I think almost exactly 2 years ago, in the spring of 2009, I was at a conference that's held every year near O'Hare Airport of a group called Autism One, and I only later found out that there were a number of other reporters who were there, all of whom were kicked out before the end of the weekend because of the perception that they were not sympathetic to the views that Autism One was presenting and was advocating. I think at this point I would probably not be welcome there. But I know, because I've heard from a lot of people, that a lot of the people who I met there and met at other have very negative feelings about me. That I think is really unfortunate and actually makes me sad, not because I don't like it when people don't like me, which I don't, but because it's a group of people that I both feel connected to, and I feel that they are getting really the short end of the stick in many, many ways. And I wrote a little bit about this in my book. I came away from those conferences, or conferences like that, feeling as if what was most valuable about those was not that it was a series of days of presentations and seminars advocating activism against vaccines. And this is somewhat controversial, but I very strongly feel that that was what they were. I was at presentations that compared American vaccination policy to Nazi eugenics. It said that, caffeine. Presentations that predicted trials of pharmaceutical companies and doctors that would be the equivalent of the Nuremberg trials, discussions of civil disobedience. So even though the public rhetoric is a lot under the rubric of vaccine safety, I very strongly feel that it's actually anti-vaccine. But ultimately, I think that that could just have easily been anti-car exhaust or anti-cell phone radiation. Not because this was some arbitrary thing picked out of the ether, but because what was most valuable about these meetings were the sense of support and community that parents were getting that they were not getting anywhere else. Anyone who has spoken with a family, with a child, especially on the more severe end of the autism spectrum, can share really atrocious stories about the ways that those families have been treated in public, about the ways that families have been treated by the medical community. You know, the number of times I spoke with families who got a diagnosis at age 4 or 5 from their pediatrician. A diagnosis that their pediatrician gave them essentially by looking at a checklist in a book, and then said, okay, well, I can't help you anymore. Good luck. We have no pediatric neurologist in this area. We have no intervention programs. I'm not sure where to direct you for education. I don't know what to tell you about what to expect. That, I think, represents an enormous failure on the part of our society. And the fact that there are parents and families that find themselves moving from city to city or county to county or state to state because the levels of care are so different. Because in Massachusetts, you will get care until you're 21, and in many states you won't. I think that's disgraceful. And so what struck me about these meetings was, or these conferences, was that here was a place where parents could get together and actually talk about what it's like to be on a bus and have a child start lashing out violently, or have a child who defecates in public, or who starts screaming, and actually laugh about that experience and know that the person next to them isn't going to look at them or actually say to them and say, can't you do something about this? Can't you control your child? Can't you make him or her stop? And that happens all the time. The way I went about my research on this was really 2 phases. I did the kind of shoe leather reporting, what I was just talking about first, and then I spent what I thought would only be a couple months, but ended up being almost a year, dealing with the scientific evidence, reading science journals. If anyone has this on a Kindle and is not yet done, and you're at like 40% and you're thinking, oh my God, I cannot believe that this guy is going on for this long. Actually, only about 70% of the book is the book. The rest is all source notes and bibliography. So you don't need to worry that you're probably about more than halfway done. And you can tell that in the book very clearly, but on a Kindle it's a little bit harder. So, but I spent months and months going through science journals, and what struck me at the end of that was I was really amazed at how little controversy there is from a scientific standpoint. This is not an issue about which there is really a lot left to debate. And when I say this is not an issue, I'm not talking about vaccine safety generally. I think one mistake that happens a lot, especially in the medical and public health community in talking about this, is giving the impression that there is never any risk to vaccines. And I think parents clearly know that that's not true, just like parents know that there's no risk to having a soda with ice or wearing a seatbelt, or there are risks with everything. There are very clear risks with vaccination, including febrile seizures, including fever, including rashes, and in some cases, including serious long-term damage. Because of how much focus and obsession there has been about autism, I think that we do know that autism is not a potential outcome of vaccines, and we probably know that with more confidence than we do about almost any potential vaccine injury. And the reason for that is because I think millions and millions of dollars has been wasted year after year replicating these same studies in an effort to satisfy a constituency that is clearly not going to be satisfied about this issue. And I think that's another illustration of one of the tragedies about this, because everyone, again, with some caveats, you can never say everyone, agrees that there is likely some environmental factor adding to the increase in autism rates over the past decade. However, all environmental research, or the vast majority of environmental research, has gone down this black hole of vaccines. And so there's been years and years and millions of dollars that could have been spent looking at other potential environmental factors that has not happened. And I think that's, I think that is a true tragedy. I'm going to touch on one or two other things. This can turn into an hour and a half lecture on my part, and I would rather curtail it a little bit and open it up. I think we have a small enough crowd so that we can hopefully get to most of the questions people have, and I think it's likely a lot of other topics that I may talk about are going to get touched on by what you all bring up. But so I'm going to fast forward over how this, how we got to where we are today, and skip over the history of this conflict, starting with the Andrew Wakefield paper in 1998. I don't know how many of you are aware of that. Some, okay. Well, if you're not, then I'll give you a very quick history of that. Essentially, there have been concerns about vaccines forever, especially when vaccines are effective and incidence of a given disease can go down. That's when anxiety about vaccine tends to go up. When a disease is endemic in a population, people want the vaccine. When a disease is gone from a population, the risks of the vaccine-preventable disease obviously recede in people's minds, and anxieties about vaccines crop up. So there have long been different concerns associated with the vaccines. There wasn't really any discussion or connection drawn between vaccines and autism until 1998, when a British researcher named Andrew Wakefield was the lead author in a paper that was published in a medical journal called The Lancet, and he and his co-authors posited a potential link between the measles component of the MMR vaccine and a previously unidentified gut disorder, and then between that gut disorder and autism. And the mechanisms through which this were proposed were a little bit odd. It involved heroin-addicted mice, and the work of a researcher who then later concluded that homosexuality was caused by mothers who take morphine or heroin, and he concluded that because he thought that that morphine-addicted mice apparently acted very fey, and so that clearly one clearly led to the other. But so the 1998 Wakefield study was based on, it was a case study of 12 children. And in the years since then, there have been a series of revelations about financial conflicts of interest, potential academic fraud. That paper has been retracted. My view is and has always been that taking aside all of that, it still seems a little bit crazy to me that any population-wide conclusions were drawn from a 12-person case study, and that any of this came out of that initial study. And I'll give you a very quick illustration of why that is. A 12-person case study is literally just saying that the 12 children who came into his office for this study exhibited something that he thought indicated a trend. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So there's a 12-person case study. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. From that, I'm going to conclude that 75% of the population is female. And that, I don't want to offend anyone, but I think all of you are over 15. And 100% of the population is over 15 years old. Is that true? I can't really see you, but if you're, no offense, if not, yes, yeah, I'm not. A 12-person case study is not the way that you would draw a population-wide conclusion. So that's just a brief introduction, mainly so if this comes up in any of the questions, you know what it is I'm referring to. The reason why I think this is such an important issue today, and the reason why I've continued to talk about it long past the point that my wife wishes I would stop. She keeps saying, can't you write about something where people don't get so angry, like politics or baseball? So right now, if you look at vaccination uptake rates in the country as a whole, it might appear that this really isn't an issue. Vaccine uptake rates remain fairly high, approaching 90% in some areas. And in fact, that's what the CDC those are the figures the CDC refers to when they say that actually parents have faith in vaccines. This is not a huge issue. This is something that's being overblown. I'm frankly a little bit astounded that the CDC says that. And the reason is because when you're talking about vaccine uptake rates, what the rates are in a country as a whole are almost meaningless. Because the notion of herd immunity, of there being enough immunity in a population so that a given disease can't spread, has nothing to do with what the vaccination rates are in California for people in this room. It has to do with a city or a county, or in some cases, even an individual school. Last week in Virginia, an entire school was closed down because half of the students were infected with whooping cough. It was an area with a very high number of unvaccinated students. Right now in Minnesota, there is a measles outbreak that started in a community with a high number of unvaccinated people. There are now 20 infections, 17 associated with the initial index case that started in that community. That's way more than the total combined number in the state for the last dozen years. 6 of the children who have been infected were younger than a year old, which means they were too young to have been vaccinated. Their families did not have this choice. And 10 children so far have been hospitalized in that case. Last year in California, 10 infants died of whooping cough. 9 of those were under 6 months old, which means they were too young to have been fully vaccinated. So right now in Utah, there's a measles outbreak, the first confirmed case, the first outbreak in the state since 2004 or 2005. So this is an issue, and I think will only continue to be an issue. And it's something that I think we need to address and confront as a society. I think right now, every single group in the food chain in this is failing. I think the public health community is failing. I think the medical community is failing. I think the pediatric community on the sort of ground truth level is failing, and I think parents are failing. I think parents are failing when they do not research these decisions, and I think parents are failing when they do not confront their peers, who are, if you are a parent who has researched these decisions, I don't actually think it's acceptable if someone says, oh, well, I just decided not to vaccinate, to say, oh, okay, you know, pass the ketchup, and that's not a topic for polite conversation. I find that to be totally unacceptable. I want to make a very clear distinction here between parents who are not personally affected by this and are deciding not to vaccinate, and those are very clearly the parents who are going to shape how this evolves in the years to come, and parents like the ones that I met at Autism One, and like a lot of the ones I interact with on the interwebs who do have this, because I cannot stand up here and say that I know what my reaction would be if I had a child who had a developmental disability and I was failed by the medical community, and I got support from a community that told me that they had an answer for this issue about which there are not very good answers or very satisfying answers. So I think why don't we end, or why don't I end there and open it up? There's some other points I can get to if we run out of things to talk about. That has not happened yet. So I'm doubting it'll happen here, but there's always the first. So is there anything you all want to ask about or talk about? Yes?
Is there any group or part of the country that you'd say are especially off the charts when people are refusing vaccinations? Is it cut across everyone sort of equally?
It tends, well, there was a measles outbreak in San Diego a couple of years ago. And I was talking with an epidemiologist at the California Department of Public Health, and asked that very question. Is there some way you can identify what areas might be more at risk, or predict where you might need to focus your efforts? And he said, yes, we take a map and we put a pin every place there's a Whole Foods, and we draw a circle and every time I don't know, remember when Colin Powell said, was talking about Iraq, and he said the Pottery Barn rule is in effect? You break it, you fix it. It was something like that. And he either was sued or had to apologize to Pottery Barn. So whenever I say that, I sort of think, I hope there's not like the General Counsel of Whole Foods. You tend to see lower vaccine uptake rates in communities that are more likely to self-identify as environmentally conscious, more likely to self-identify as being politically liberal, higher than average median income, more likely to be college educated or have graduate degrees. There is then, there's on the other side of the political spectrum, you get, there's some of this within very strong libertarian communities. But that's coming from, it's coming from a different place, and it's not nearly as much of an issue. So in Boulder, Colorado, it's a big issue. In Marin County in California, Ashland, Oregon is sort of the prototypical example of this. I think they have the lowest vaccine uptake rates in the country. The school in San Diego where the measles outbreak occurred was a progressive charter school. The school in Virginia that just shut down is a progressive private school. That's a very, very generalized, I guess, description or stereotype. Or, yeah, so. Yes?
Why do you think the Lancet published that? I mean, Lancet's a good journal.
Yes, yes. Can everyone hear? Can you guys hear in the back of the? Yes. Okay. Yeah. There's been a lot of speculation about that, and what the opinion that some people have, and I guess I, myself included, to some extent, is that the editor of the Lancet, Richard Horton, was a relatively new editor, was very young. I think he was the youngest editor in the history of the journal, in his 30s, and there was already, he already had a reputation of sort of trying to build buzz. And so there was some talk even before it came out, because there was a lot of criticism of the paper before it was published, that this was a sort of an attention-getting decision on his part. You know, I'm probably very mildly more sympathetic to the Lancet than a lot of scientists are. And I'm more critical of the press than a lot of scientists are. So it could just be that I feel more comfortable criticizing my peers and they feel more comfortable criticizing their peers. But what appeared in the Lancet and what Wakefield said in public are very different things. The Lancet itself, given that they made a decision to publish a very bad paper, which I think they did everything possible to show to its readers that this was not something that people should draw conclusions from. They put early report on top of every page of the actual article. They commissioned a commentary to go along with the article that was really a critique of the article, and that commentary just absolutely shredded it, which is very rare. Usually in a medical journal, if you have a commentary, it's someone saying, this is great, look at this great important research we published, not this sucks, ignore what you previously read in the last 5 pages. And the Lancet very, very conspicuously and vocally refused to participate in the press conference announcing the paper's results. And it was at that press conference that Wakefield said, I cannot in good conscience, it's not a direct quote, but I cannot in good conscience recommend that parents continue to give their children the 3-in-1 MMR vaccine. And I think that was what set things off much more than the paper itself. You know, my view is small case studies is how science gets done. It's just those small case studies serve as the first step in what has to be a series of steps before you can draw a conclusion. And you know, most case studies end up just being random noise. Most case studies also don't involve fraud, but there was no real way to know that at the time. So yeah, I mean, unless I don't know if that's a wholly satisfying answer, but yeah.
Me?
Yeah.
What has been the reactions in these autism communities towards this recent discovery that there was frauds involved in this publishing of the article? And is there starting to be a movement towards your idea of wasted dollars in research that has proven nothing?
I guess, well, 2 things, or 2 thoughts. One is that, and I'm as guilty of this as anyone, it's difficult to talk about the autism community. I think what has happened is that the most vocal advocates related to autism tend to be associated with the anti-vaccine movement. I think overall that is actually a minority of the families who are personally affected by this. And I actually have been surprised by the number of people I've heard from who have a family member with autism or know someone with autism and are glad that I wrote this book. And in fact, one thing that has come up a lot in conversations I've had with people personally connected with someone with autism who do not have anti-vaccine views is a real fear of a backlash against autism research in the autism community generally if there are a series of outbreaks that then get associated with non-vaccine uptake because of fears related to autism. So, but I think the latest accusations of fraud which appeared in January in the British Medical Journal, had the Wakefield supporters, for the most part, if they believed that there was a conspiracy against him, every further piece of evidence is actually only further proof of the conspiracy. That does not seem to have had any real change in his relationship with that community, and it certainly has not. You know, Autism One still has conferences every year, and there's still, you know, Wakefield spoke at, they had a rally in his honor last year, and so yeah, you know, I think it's one of those sort of vicious circles where if you think everyone's out to get you, anytime someone says something that is critical, it's further proof that everyone's out to get you. So yes.
So when I first heard about this issue several years ago, and I'm not a parent, I don't know anyone personally with autism, but my sister was reading a lot of books by Jenny McCarthy, and I heard that she was a big proponent of this idea, and I wondered if you would try to interview her, how much of this issue, I mean, you know, is sort of potentiated by celebrities or by someone like her that and may not have done some of her own research or where she gets these, you know, ideas.
Right. I did talk to Jenny, and she is a very vocal proponent of this. And I think she has played a big role in, I'm not sure if popularizing is the right word, but in helping to make this a part of this sort of general discussion involving vaccines. Primarily through appearances on Oprah and Larry King. You know, she reached an enormous amount of people that way. She's been on both of those shows multiple times. I guess she won't be on Larry King anymore because he doesn't have a show. But I think that was how she reached, you know, she reached sort of the most people. But what I think is interesting about that is, and I think this is another example of how the public health community and the medical community just both are falling down on the job and also just don't get it. You know, the shorthand about Jenny McCarthy is, well, I can't believe, you know, I can't believe people are listening to this stripper who was a Playboy playmate, and she actually wasn't a stripper. I know, you know, I guess technically she did strip off her clothes in Playboy, but you know, how is it that people are listening to this this bimbo playmate, and that's not who people are listening to. You know, the Oprah's audience is not 16-year-old boys. People are listening to a mother who has a child who she believes was injured by vaccines, and a mother who is incredibly eloquent and intelligent. I mean, before all of this, Jenny McCarthy had written several best-selling books about motherhood and about pregnancy, and she is smart, she is funny, and so I think the fact that she also is famous was one of the reasons why she was able to get on Oprah and Larry King. But I don't think that's why people connected. I don't think that's why parents have connected with her. I think parents have connected with her because she's a very eloquent, obviously caring mother. And so I think I'm going to sort of slightly dodge your question and say instead, I think that the media has played a huge role. I think the biggest role. I find it impossible to fault Jenny McCarthy for talking about her beliefs regarding her child. There's a website called Jenny McCarthy's Body Count, and I find that as offensive as I do accusations that pediatricians are baby killers. You know, the notion that Jenny McCarthy is actively trying to harm children, I just think is ridiculous. But I think that we, as members of the media, have a responsibility to be cognizant of the fact that when we present views we are doing more than just throwing information out there. We are giving those views, to some extent, are inflammatory. And for Oprah Winfrey to say, all I'm doing is putting this out there and letting parents then decide, is a crock. That's absolutely not true. When she has an hour-long program with someone to talk about her experiences, she's not saying, okay, well, who knows if this is right. She's, and you know, she then lauds Jenny McCarthy's courageousness and honesty, and she's saying this is something that I think is legitimate. And I think that the media has a lot to answer for. And not just talk show hosts. I mean, I think that you know, this story really started with daily newspaper journalists, with that Wakefield study. And I think that my industry failed then and has failed repeatedly since then. And the notion now that the coverage since Wakefield lost his medical license and the paper was retracted and everything, that now the coverage is some sort of corrective, is absolutely ridiculous. It's part of why I called my book The Panic Virus. You can't scare someone and then say, oh no, never mind. Actually don't think about these fears that I just put in your head the next time you're at the doctor's office and you need to hold your child down and the doctor has a needle that he's about to plunge into your kid's thigh. You know, an example I bring up all the time is razor blades and apples on Halloween. I don't know, do any of you know anyone who's ever had a razor blade and an apple on Halloween? There's only, as far as I know, one case, and that was a father trying to injure his children. But so there's this urban legend that, you know, they're boogeymen putting razor blades in apples, and even though I actually know that that is not something that has ever happened, if my son came home with an apple, there's no way I would actually then let him eat it, because that fear is in my head. Because when he puts that apple up to his mouth, what I'm going to imagine is there being a razor blade in there. So, you know, as it's not acceptable for us to say, well, information comes down, it's not our job to decide what's valid or what's not, we'll throw it out there. Because there are very real consequences of what we print and talk about on TV and talk about on air and everything like that. So, yeah.
So that the media and the medical community ought to engage with Autism One and Jenny McCarthy. What's yours?
That's interesting. I guess that the media and the medical community, or those are the two? The media, you know, I mean, I'm not sure if Autism One is something that needs further coverage from the press's part. You know, and to show what I mean, I'll use another example. When the fraud accusations against Wakefield were published in January, it was right when, it was literally, I think, the week before my book came out. My publisher was ecstatic. It only served as proof that I was part of this conspiracy, because clearly I had orchestrated. I was pulling the strings at the British Medical Journal. And then, much to my publisher's chagrin, I kept on refusing to do press with Wakefield. Because I was on one CNN show and that was it. Because I knew that all of those stories would be another, you know, on the one hand, on the other hand. Even if it was just, okay, you know, Andrew Wakefield, what do you have to say to these accusations? I don't think we need to hear what I mean, we know what he says because he's been saying it for the last 10 years. Everyone's out to get him. I think every time you then do that story again, all it serves to do is put that notion in people's heads and create the impression that there is this on the one hand, on the other hand, once again. In the same way that the birther story, I think, you know, the notion that President Obama is a Nigerian foreign agent who wasn't born in the United States, I think is ridiculous. And I think that it's not that I think it's ridiculous and offensive that that was ever a story that was covered. The fact that someone says our president was not born in the United States doesn't mean that then it's a legitimate topic of discussion. The fact that there continues to be coverage of politicians who say, why won't he show his birth certificate when his birth certificate is online? I find it astounding. And I find it astounding when reporters say, well, you know, it's news when someone says this, so we then need to report on that. That's ridiculous. I mean, it's not, you know, and by that logic, it would be news when someone said the earth was flat, or it would be news when someone said that the Holocaust didn't happen, or, and it's not for the most part. You know, we know people have those views, and we know they're wrong, and we don't feed them by giving them airtime. I'm not equating Autism One with Holocaust deniers. I'm just not sure what is going to be added to the conversation by continuing to cover that. So, you know, and from the part of the medical community, I think that there should be more compassion shown towards parents who happen to be anti-vaccine, and sometimes very strongly. And I think there should be an effort to engage those parents in whatever way is possible outside of that issue. And I think that that's actually possible. And as an example, I'll talk about something that happened with me personally. There is the editor of a very vocal anti-vaccine blog, and a blog that has written a series of articles about me, you know, including one that made family members of mine cry. I mean, you know, not nice stuff. The editor of that blog has a non-communicative child, you know, a child who can't, a nonverbal child who I think is 9, who was physically abused on her school bus by the school bus monitor, and the school bus driver was actually the bus monitor's mother, and it turned out had been texting while she was driving the bus and while this abuse was going on. And so the mother, who is the editor of this blog, wrote about this, and I also wrote about it and said that this is not a group that I agree with, and this is not a site that I agree with, but I think it's important that everyone be aware of the challenges that families are dealing with. And the mother had a petition that she was putting together for to present to the judge because the bus driver was going to get off without a record. And I said, I actually don't feel comfortable advocating signing the petition because I don't know all of the issues involved. But I think this is something that people should be aware of. She wrote to me and thanked me, the mother, and I think there was some, you know, it was the first sort of I hate you words, I think, that spoken on either side. I mean, I think it was the first time she thought that I probably displayed any compassion for her. I think that shows how you don't, you know, we obviously disagree very strongly about a very fundamental issue, but there are things that she and I can agree on, and there are things that the medical community and groups like Autism One can agree on. And I think should find do everything they can to find common ground instead of treating Autism One like the enemy. And I think another big problem with that is parents really don't like when other parents are attacked. It doesn't matter what the context is. So when I think parents have the impression that this group of parents, anti-vaccine parents, are being dismissed or attacked by the medical establishment, I don't think it matters what parents, what the other group of parents actually thinks about Autism One. The instinctual empathy and sympathy is going to be for other parents, and I understand that. I think it, yeah, so. Did you sort of have your hand up? No? Okay, sorry. Yes?
In your legwork and research, did you come across any information related to the parents who are opting not to vaccinate before their kids have autism, and whether there's any difference in incidence in those children? Because now it's been a number of years where they could be collecting that.
Right, yes. So, yes, there is some data about that. The problem is that the sample size is very small, and it self-selects in a number of other ways in terms of parents who are more likely not to vaccinate are also parents who are on average older and whiter and more likely to have a family member who has a developmental disability. So there are a number of factors that make that very tricky. And another final factor is there is no national vaccine database in the United States. So it's very hard to get, for instance, in this school in Virginia that shut down because of the pertussis infections, there were no good records on a government level about who and who had not been vaccinated, because there, some doctors' offices are better about reporting it than others. There are countries where that data is more readily available, Denmark and Sweden being two of them, because the vaccine program is administered by the state and they're meticulous about keeping health records. So when there have been comparisons between vaccinated and unvaccinated children, there either has tended to be no difference, or in some studies there actually was a slightly higher incidence of autism in non-vaccinated children. But that I think that's just random noise and the result of there not being a huge number of people to compare it to. The overall, it does not at all indicate that not vaccinating adds to autism, but that there is no, excuse me, there is no difference. There have also been studies, and there's more data about this, just because there are more children who fit into one of these categories, again in Denmark and Norway and Sweden, in children who received vaccines with thimerosal, which is a mercury-based preservative, versus ones who didn't, or children who had received individual components of the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine versus the all-in-one, or had not received the MMR vaccine. But it's much more likely that children are going to be partially vaccinated than wholly unvaccinated. So that's why it's also easier to do some of those studies. But there are a lot of calls for, okay, well, why don't we just put together a vaccinated versus unvaccinated study, the way you would put together any scientific study. And to me, the answers as to why you can't do that are obvious, because you can't take a community and say, all of you kids, we're not going to vaccinate you, even though 10 kids died of whooping cough last year in California. So all you can really do is these backwards looking studies. But so, yes, those studies have been done, sort of.
So my follow-up question was actually going to be what you just talked about. That Wakefield's original study was the triple measles, the MMR.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And then it was the issue of the thimerosal in it,
right.
the mercury, and possibly the measles, not the measles, whatever. And so then there were families who chose to ask their doctors to separate it, and then it's been a number of years since thimerosal has been out of it.
Right.
So you said that there is some data on those particular issues, and then how did it get to be that we're now talking about all vaccinations rather
Right.
than the original study, and so is that truly wasted study, research, and dollars
Right.
if we're now looking at a multiple of things rather than just the specific MMR?
Right. So a couple of things. The thimerosal issue. Thimerosal is a ethylmercury-based preservative that had been used in not all, but some multi-dose vaccines, and that was stopped. It is no longer in childhood vaccines, and now has not been for about a decade. There are some variations, but not all variations of the flu vaccine. So essentially, there is no thimerosal in childhood vaccines anymore. And it actually, thimerosal was never in the MMR vaccine. It was in the pertussis, diphtheria, tetanus vaccine, I think also maybe the hepatitis B vaccine, but not the MMR vaccine. So those studies in I'm not sure if it was in the 70s or the 80s, but either in the 70s or the 80s, in Denmark and Norway, there were actually 2 variants of the pertussis, diphtheria, tetanus vaccine that were in use. One had thimerosal and one didn't. So they could compare those. And they had, hundreds of thousands of children and cumulatively millions of years, looking at 10 or 12 years of all of these children. So that was how those thimerosal studies were done. I need to admit, I'm always a little bit confused when that mercury still seems to be such an overwhelming concern, because it's now been gone for 10 years, and since then, autism rates have not declined. In fact, they've continued to go up. There was, an author of a book about all this who said, well, if autism rates don't start declining by the middle of the last decade, we'll know that thimerosal was not connected, because then it has been 3 and 4 and 5 years since thimerosal was taken out, so those children are old enough to start to get these diagnoses. And I think what you see is it becomes a sort of whack-a-mole argument. So, okay, well then we've answered that part of thimerosal. Well, maybe it's because the parents have thimerosal in their bloodstreams from vaccines that they received, or then maybe it is because now there's more mercury in the environment than there was 10 years ago, so even though there's not thimerosal in vaccines anymore, children are still getting it somehow, or and I think that's what we're seeing now. It's gone from it being the measles component of the MMR to it being thimerosal as a preservative, to it being aluminum, to it being too many too soon, and I think one of the problems and frustrations is that there will never be an end to the issues that are raised, regardless of the validity. And I think it's frustrating for researchers, but it's also difficult. It can be difficult to explain to the public. In other words, for instance, so if Jenny McCarthy says on Lyra King, as she did, well, let's just do a vaccinated versus unvaccinated study, then we'll know. In the next 30 seconds or whatever that the head of the American Academy of Pediatrics has, he or she is not going to be able to go through all of that history and say, well, we actually have these studies, and this is the reason why we can't do that, but this is what we do know and why we know it. And so the head of the AAP or the head of the National Institute of Health then says, well, we can't do those studies and we have the data, and then they refuse to do it, and that's the end of the segment. I understand why viewers and parents come away from that thinking that not everything is being done that could be done. Yeah.
So this is, you brought up that this is a broader issue than just vaccines and global warming, cell phone dangers,
right,
and any other scientific issue. There's the scientific research, and there's somebody who decides that the scientific research is wrong
Right.
and expresses an opinion because of financial interests, global warming,
Right.
just general fears, cell phones,
Right.
and, you know, if, with all the thinking you've done about this, do you have any thoughts about how to, you know, obviously the news is
That's what we do about this.
predominantly
Right.
responsible.
Right.
And your comment about both sides
Right.
is kind of where it comes from. But how do you solve this?
I think there are a couple of, I mean, if I knew how to solve it, I would be
Yeah.
making public policy or, I definitely wouldn't be writing books. I think there are a couple of answers, or I guess not answers, but I have a couple of thoughts. I think one, we can become more intelligent consumers of information. And I don't think that's, that sounds like some crazy, lofty idea, but I don't actually think it is. I mean, I think that we can become more intelligent consumers of information without an enormous amount of work. All that really means is being more aware of the sources of information. So if we go online, realizing that even though there's not any volume control for what one screen looks like the next screen, that there is a difference in how, in the value associated with information and in the resources associated with that information. One of the things we can do to help with that is show that we're willing to pay for information. I'm a big proponent of subscribing to newspapers and magazines, and I think from the media's perspective, I think we need to be more responsible and more reasoned about how we cover science and health and medicine. And for some reason, we hold ourselves, and the public holds us, to a much lower standard in those topics than we do in business or in sports. If I came here and said, I believe that Derrick Rose is engaged in a conspiracy with LeBron James, and the Bulls are actually going to throw the Eastern Conference, and then someone called Derrick Rose and said, that's absolutely crazy, what are you talking about? No sports reporter the next day would then do an on the one hand, on the other hand story. If I said Apple Computers is on the verge of shutting down, and then Steve Jobs said no business reporter would do that. But in science and health and politics, we get those type of stories. And I don't think it's too much to ask that we don't. And I also don't think that it's totally unrealistic to expect a sort of institutional change in that regard, institutional meaning the media. The first book I wrote was about the New York Times and a series of plagiarism scandals they had 6 or 7 or 8 years ago that resulted in the firing of their editor. And in very short order after that, the entire culture in the media shifted in regards to ombudsmen and women and reader representatives and viewer representatives. And previous to that, the sort of the attitude within newsrooms was almost that that was an offensive proposition. That we don't decide what news is based on someone calling into the reader representative and complaining about X or Y. And almost overnight, the attitude shifted to that is a valuable way to sort of crowdsource information. And we can't always be aware of all of the concerns, but our readers and our viewers can, and sometimes the concerns that they raise are going to be very valuable. And now it's major newspapers have ombudsmen. NPR has a listener representative. TV networks have viewer representatives. So there was a huge culture shift in a very short amount of time. And I think it's, you know, so it's possible that we can have a serious conversation within our industry about how we cover science and hopefully start to see some change. I think we'll wrap up in a couple of minutes, and then I will be here signing books. Let me make a pitch for you to buy books. I will not see any of that money. I will never earn out my advance, so it doesn't matter how many books people buy. I will never see any more money than I have. I can guarantee that. But when people buy books, publishers know that there is an interest in books, and I have a vested interest and actually do believe that books are good things. So, you know, buy them for presents. I'll sign them and draw pictures. And yeah, but even if you don't, I really appreciate your coming out here. It's just been a long talk, and I'm really glad you're all part of the conversation. So I'll take, you know, 1 or 2 more questions, and then I'll also stick around if people have other questions that didn't get answered. I can, just for the mere price of a book, I can answer them. Yes?
I have a niece who got caught up in this autism scare thing, and I would say she spent $200,000 on fake cures at this point, and has really harmed the finances of the family. I did some work, and there's an enormous conspiracy of quack doctors in this field who have fake journals and fake medical conferences where they give intentional misinformation, and they make fortunes on selling these useless products. Most of them are useless. A couple that are dangerous.
Right. Yeah.
And so you're going against some really vested interests in this whole area. And I'm just curious, trying to deprogram my niece or my daughter who is not vaccinating her kids seems very difficult. It's a religious cult as far as I can see.
Well, it's one of the things that is so interesting to me is that there are people who are very quick to accuse the CDC of financial conflicts of interest, and yet when they have a doctor who is simultaneously telling them that vaccines are to blame and then offering to sell them a $35,000 hyperbaric oxygen chamber, there's no perception of that being a conflict of interest. Or, you know, I hope that in both my talk and my book, I'm able to make clear that I think that almost everyone involved in this, I think, is coming from good and pure intentions. The people you're talking about, I do not think that, and I would say it's below no patience for it. I mean, I think it's morally reprehensible what is going on, and at that conference, in the exhibit hall, the cures that were being pitched, you know, the home saunas, for families, 2 families who clearly were desperately looking for answers and clearly did not have $35,000 for a hyperbaric oxygen chamber. It turned my stomach. You know, I wish there was more, and related to your point about there being some of this being dangerous, I wish there was more oversight. I mean, at that conference there was a father-son team who were pitching this cure related to their theory that autism was the result of high testosterone levels, and so they were selling injections of a drug that's used to chemically castrate sex offenders, and it was like $70,000 a year, and it was only at their clinics, and it mortified. I mean, I just found it shocking. I wish I knew, you know, I wish I knew. I wish I had some ideas about that. In terms of your daughter who's wondering about vaccination, I think that in the same way that narratives from parents who believe that their children have been vaccine injured can be very powerful. I think stories from parents whose children have really suffered or died from vaccine-preventable diseases can be very powerful. I have a couple of those in my book. I mean, not to be, not to make a sales pitch, but they're also at least one of those stories I have free online. Also, in fact, both of them I think I have. I've put online. One, a story of a couple who lost their daughter to whooping cough when she was 4 weeks old, and one, the story of a family who deliberately did not vaccinate, and then their youngest son got HIV and was in a medically induced coma, and both of them I find extremely painful stories. So, I think that might be information that would be worthwhile to share. There are a couple of different groups that also make an effort to find parents who dealt with experiences like that and have them share their stories. There's one called PKids, which stands for Parents of Kids with Infectious Disease, and that you can find them online. Yeah, as someone with an 18-month-old son, 17-month-old son, I find vaccine-preventable diseases really scary, and the idea that if you get measles, you have to stay home for a week, and that's the worst that's going to happen is it's one of those examples of vaccines being a victim of their own success. But I'm sorry about your niece and her family, and I wish that we were not living in an environment where she felt like she had been so failed by the non-quack community that was where she had to go to for answers. There's a great reporter in Chicago for the Chicago Tribune named Trina Sugaris, who writes about a lot of, she's written about autism treatments and writes about a lot of these things, but yeah, I'm sorry. I think I'll do one very quick question, and then we'll take it outside. Yeah?
I was just thinking, you might want to look into the idea that just medicine has been victimized for many, many years with fad and fashion. There was a time when bloodletting was the thing to do.
Yes. Yeah.
There was a time when circumcision was the thing to do.
I think we're still in that time. Yeah.
For example, in England, 90% of the children are no longer circumcised.
Right.
Whereas it was done in Queen Victoria's time for all sorts of ridiculous reasons. C-sections have become an epidemic.
Right.
It's just incredible.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think clearly one...
Fashion with no legitimate, and then there's the idea too that the data is manipulated to support predetermined conclusions. I mean,
I think, one of the... I'm oftentimes asked to defend drug companies and drug companies' studies, and I would never do that. I mean, drug companies manipulate studies all the time. We've seen that over the last couple of years. Drug companies, essentially invent diseases. When it comes to vaccines, fortunately, we're not relying solely on drug company data. We have data from governments around the world, built up over decades. But yes, it's clear there are a lot of problems with the medical, with healthcare and with the medical system, and those different examples get into different issues. I think C-section is that's something that stems from in many cases malpractice anxiety and litigation anxiety. I think, in fact, ironically, a bigger problem in this country is overtreatment. Because there's a sense, both on patients and by doctors, that they would rather do too much than too little. On the doctor's part, because they want to be accused of not doing something, on the patient's part, because I think there's a poor understanding that there are risks to every treatment, and it's not, you know, that oftentimes the safest option is not to just do as much as you can. But yeah, it's, you know, there are a lot of problems with how medicine is practiced. Vaccines happen to be one of those issues that are very cost effective and very effective. You know, I certainly would never go around and talk about how everyone should have total faith in the medical community and medicine. So, thank you all so much for coming. I'll be right out there, and have a great day. Derek Rose is not going to throw the playoffs. Yeah, and thank you very much.